Hello everyone, welcome to Identity, a podcast all about Web3 and digital identity. My name's Nick Lambert and I have the pleasure of being joined today by Marie Wallace of Accenture. Marie, thanks for coming on.
Hi Nick, it's a pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. So as a brief intro, Marie is working for Accenture, currently the Managing Director of Digital Identity, and she kind of leads that team at Accenture. Previously, Marie was an IBM Distinguished Engineer, and you have spent more than 2 decades, Marie, building artificial intelligence technology as well, some of which I think underpins IBM Watson technology as well. So you've had a nice broad remit there, and you're a perfect guest for Identity. So thanks again for coming on.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
So we'll get started. So as we mentioned, Marie, you kind of were working at IBM for quite a large amount of your career. I was also at IBM for a lesser time, but good to meet another IBMer. But you're chief architect of the IBM Digital Health Pass, and you built a digital identity solution, or IBM did, allowing individuals to manage their own COVID status. So can you introduce us into the IBM Digital Health Pass as a kind of some context for people listening in? Specifically, what was it? How did it work? And how did you incorporate digital identity technology into that solution?
Yes. So we had been working. We've been working in sort of the decentralized identity, and just actually let me step back just quickly before I start that, because I just want to kind of how I ended up getting into this space, because it'll be relevant when we move forward on this. So you mentioned that I spent a lot of time in the AI space, which I did, 2 decades building AI, and one of the things that became fairly evident, and I was focused specifically on AI in the sense of things like smart assistants, recommendation systems, how we make computers more useful to human beings, so how we analyze and understand what humans need. And so it was all about analyzing human data, people data, and so it started before, in the early days of social media, when you were looking at analyzing social media for kind of a sales channel, so a whole set of things. But what became fairly evident within a few years of doing this is that while those of us in the space, at least a lot of us, had very, inspirational and kind of, we wanted to see this new, smarter, more useful set of technology that would help people, there was a lot of opportunity for exploitation. So one of the things I became increasingly interested in is the whole ethics of data science, and the reason I emphasize this is because I became increasingly convinced that in order for us to build a future society that we all want to live in, where it's smart, it's got technology, it's got AI, it's data driven, this is going to happen anyway, but it's one that we feel safe and protected and not exploited in, we need to give individuals greater autonomy and agency over their own data. So the interest I had originally was decentralized. I got introduced into the self-sovereign identity space maybe about 7 years ago. But the reason I just mentioned this specifically, because this is going to be a theme throughout the rest of the questions, is when I think about it, it's not just about decentralized identity. In fact, it's more about decentralized data exchange. It's more about empowering people with their own data and allowing them to choose how it's shared, what is shared, for it to be data minimizing, to ensure that the consumers of the data are very constrained around what they can and can't do with that data, limiting the amount of data that these consumers, relying parties, need to actually consume. So the reason I mention this is because, this is to some extent was the driving theme behind the IBM Digital Health Pass. We, as I said, spent a lot of time doing AI, then started to move into this whole idea of decentralized data exchange. And then the next thing, COVID happened. So all of a sudden, everybody wanted to try and do something to help with the COVID situation, and IBM was no exception. We had at the time, and I think IBM still does. I think 20 years at IBM, it's hard to stop saying we, but IBM, they had at the time, they did a lot of charitable stuff. So they really, really wanted to try and do something for COVID. So I was approached to say, look, all this cool decentralized data exchange stuff you're doing, could this be helpful for COVID? Particularly because the big elephant in the room is is that healthcare entities that are under HIPAA, and they're used to managing health data. So the hospitals and the testing centres, employers and travel agents, and they're not used to dealing with health data. They don't want to be dealing with health data. The last thing they want was to have to be under HIPAA. So they needed to have a way that they could get somebody's proof of vaccination or proof of COVID's testing status without actually having to hold any health data. They did not want to be holding that. So it was the absolute quintessential use case for the self-sovereign identity, in that it was a situation where the data consumers did not want the data, but they needed to verify that the data existed, or the status of the data. They need to verify the COVID status. And the other thing that was quintessentially SSI about this particular use case is that it needed to be massively scalable. And the example I always give, which was the nightmare of, for example, football season. During football season, if you just imagine a scenario that every I think, is it Saturday or Sunday, whichever day during the weekend all the football games happen in the US, they all more or less happen around the same time. They have big audiences in all the different cities. Everybody streams into the stadium around the same time, an hour, 2 hours before the event starts, maybe a couple of hours before the event starts. So all of a sudden you have this massive spike of the need to be able to theoretically verify these COVID credentials. So this really, it would be a stress on any type of system, just the spike required. So the thing that's nice about the self-sovereign identity approach was that you can do verification on the edge. So everything is basically peer-to-peer and on the edge, which effectively means it's massively scalable. It's scalable to as many entrances that you have in the stadiums, and as many people are holding tablets that they can scan QR codes or that they can exchange credentials. So it was a really attractive architecture for building these types of systems. So what was it? It basically comprised an issuing service, so that entities like testing centres, like governments that are managing COVID vaccination status, so that they could basically issue a verifiable credential. So that was one key piece of it. The second piece of it was a verifier service. So it was a set of APIs that would allow a verifier app, which was the other piece, the verifier app to basically verify a credential. Because we did everything to be on the edge, both for performance reasons and for scalability reasons, but also for privacy reasons, we didn't want to have anything going up to a central server. The verifier service was predominantly about configuring the rules of verification, and all the data was then held in the verifier app. So for example, if I'm in one country, so if I look at Europe as an example, they might not only want to verify the credential is valid, but they might also want to check, is it a type of test? So these are the tests that we trust for COVID. Is it one of these tests? So there's all these business rules that you build in. So the verifier wasn't just verifying a credential, but it was actually applying business logic. And then the final part was the app. So it was a wallet app where it allowed individuals to hold their credentials. It had integrated ID&V in there, so you could actually, in cases where you wanted to verify somebody's identity in a very strong way, there was an ID&V built into the wallet. There's obviously consent management built in as well. So things like whenever credentials would get exchanged, kind of consent receipts were generated, and they would be exchanged they would be held in the wallet, and then they would also obviously be exchanged with the receiver of the data. So it was designed really to be very much an enterprise type system, so having kind of enterprise protections that. So that was basically, those are the pieces of the solution. Yeah.
That's great. And so there was two apps. There was a wallet app, and then there was also a verifier app as well that exactly. I guess the countries or the regions would use to verify the COVID tests that the individual had.
Exactly, and the verifier apps would be mobile and web. So it was like, mobile, and then those variations of web, Node.js, Python, variations of web apps. So that was, and the reason we did that as well was for a couple of things. One is we needed to ensure, at least in the likes of Europe where regulation is really strict, we needed a verifier app that was encapsulated, because it had to do things like, for example, it would have, so a policy, when I talked about these policies, verification policies, it wouldn't just be about verifying the credential, it might be what can be shown on the screen. So in Europe, for example, when you're verifying a credential, you cannot show the person's name You provide the name, but you couldn't show any other information on the screen, as an example. The Verify app couldn't hold any data, so it couldn't hold or transmit any data. So this way we were able to ensure a level of privacy that you couldn't ensure if you had just any random Verifier app with a Verifier set of APIs. So this is the reason why we focus on a Verifier app, to meet these very specific privacy concerns that COVID was creating.
And Marie, what kind of level of adoption did you see with that? Was that something that went into production and was actually something that you were, the intention was it was used, I'll use the phrase, in the real world, or was it kind of a large scale pilot?
No, it was absolutely used in the real world. So in New York, for example, there was the Accenture Pass, and the Accenture Pass was actually the IBM Digital Health Pass rebranded for New York. So it actually ran, so all of the New York credentials that were issued during COVID for COVID vaccinations or test results, they were all issued with IBM Digital Health Pass. And the app, the Accenture Pass app, was basically built on the IBM Digital Health Pass SDK. So that was a really example. There were some other use cases we had in Europe, but the biggest production one was the New York scenario, and which also, the thing that was interesting about that, it also really reinforced what makes this type of architecture so attractive, in that, you know, we were issuing millions and millions of these credentials and hundreds of potentially millions of verifications. And our systems were super lightweight, because ultimately what you're doing is you're caching keys on the Verifier apps, you're syncing things up on a, you know, depending on how regularly the Verifier apps wants to sync the policies for the verification. And actually then everything else is peer-to-peer. So you didn't have, you know, these situations where you were concerned about, you know, servers going down or the internet glitching, or because that just never ever was an issue. So it was probably the biggest project, I think, I can't say for sure, but it had to be one of the biggest projects IBM released with the minimum number of issues. We had like literally no issues with the system. So it was a very robust way of building up these types of applications.
And that's the great thing about the kind of a couple of advantages there of decentralized technology. I'm definitely, although I'd be an advocate of it, it can be expensive to do, and there are sometimes more straightforward ways of doing things. Like that, there's definitely sometimes a push for people, sometimes in the Web3 space, to, you know, almost talk about decentralization like it's the be all and end all, and it's not. It needs to suit the use case. But it sounds like what you're describing here, Marie, is where there's a win-win scenario. So decentralized is enabling the architecture to scale massively, but also it's also enabling the individual to control and manage their own data in a way that, you know, there's no third party doing it on their behalf. So that's really where decentralization can come into its own, where it's a really excellent use case for it.
Yeah, and I guess I would argue, I mean, I've heard cases as well of people saying, and let me just say, decentralization doesn't mean necessarily blockchain. So I know blockchain does come with it some overheads, but if we think about this self-sovereign identity concept in general, I often hear people saying it's more expensive, but actually I would argue the opposite. I would argue it may be more expensive or more challenging from an implementation standpoint. When you're trying to put it in place, you're getting the issuers and verifiers on board, you're putting the networks to play. You know, that piece is obviously, because you are reliant on more parties. If you centralize everything, stick it into a big, you know, data warehouse or a data lake, you know, but then the problem is once that's been implemented, then you've got this mammoth operational cost of managing the system, managing consent, there's all this operational side, which you don't have the same in a decentralized. So I guess I would argue with decentralization, if done right, you're maybe front loading some of the cost on implementation side, but you have a much more lightweight operational model then downstream. So it's basically, you know, I guess I would argue I'm not convinced it's necessarily more expensive, but it does require more maybe complexity when you're initially designing the system and getting the network together.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah, I think that's a point well made. I think as well, and that probably means, as a slight tangent to the kind of main topic, but I suppose that means as well that when you're trying to, particularly, I mean, as a startup as well, and when you're trying to get in, even as a large company, trying to get projects off the ground, sometimes it's the centralized way can make it easier to do POCs, to actually make sure that there's a demand for what you're building. And I suppose that the tricky part for decentralization, if a lot of the costs and the effort is front loaded, it becomes difficult, because if you're having to put all the work in at the start and then there's not a demand for what you're building, can make things a little bit trickier. But maybe that's just a case for iterative development, I suppose.
Yeah, and I guess what I would argue to that, I mean, you're correct, but the trick there, and this is very much what I know we in Accenture are focused on, is identifying the use cases that allow for that sort of incremental MVP. So, for example, if you have a use case, like I'll give an example of a tough use case, like borders, touchless borders. So we're involved in that. It's a hugely valuable use case, but it's extremely difficult, because if you imagine, touchless border effectively means every single country that has people coming into your country nearly need to be onboarded. So it's a very, very large network required in order to make it work. Whereas if you're looking at, for example, something like worker credentialing, or where you might have a much smaller network required in order to start to deliver value, it becomes much more doable. So I guess I would argue that what we probably need to do is twofold. One is we identify the use cases that are more optimized or designed, or more that sort of MVP incremental is more achievable. And then what we at the same time focus on is really emphasizing the long-term value, both in terms of cost saving, but also risk mitigation. And so it is tricky, I would agree with you, but I think we're in a better place now than we maybe were 5 years ago. And I think the market is we're at that cusp of the market being really ready for broad-scale adoption.
No, I agree. I very much hope you're right, and I'm of the same view. But I think it's definitely a good place, and there's quite a lot of momentum in the market with some of the regulation coming in Europe, and some of the bigger players in the US starting to move into this space. It would give an indication that we're kind of getting ready for kind of getting close to mass market, or at least kind of early adoption.
Yeah.
I also appreciate at the start, Marie, your the common thread that kind of brings together AI and identity for you, and the ability for the individual to control their own information, and in the kind of thinking about self-sovereign identity specifically, when Francisco was kind of researching for this interview, he kind of found a blog that you'd written, and I think in relation to SSI, you'd mentioned it will significantly reduce the cost and risk of consuming personal data, and realise new value propositions for both organisation and data subject. I think you touched on a little bit of that there, but maybe you could specifically address the question of how do you think SSI or decentralized identity will reduce costs and risks for businesses, I guess, and risks for the individual.
Yeah. So so let me start with costs first, and then we can talk to risks. So on the cost side of things, if we think about the way things work today, just let's have a simple example of I want to get a job. I joined Accenture in February of this year, and then as joining the company, I had to complete an onboarding process. I had to prove certain things, where I was educated, my past employment, there was a set of things, my identity, my right to work. There's a whole set of things I had to prove. And then Accenture had to take my self-attested pieces of paper or emails or whatever, and then they had to go pay a third party to go start to actually manually verify that all that data was correct. So there's a big, timely, consuming manual process that has to happen every single time I self-attest something, for a company to say, well, yeah, actually Marie did self-attest that, but it is actually valid. So I think that is both a significant cost to the business, because they now have to kind of do all this, they have to do all this manual validation. It's also, to a value proposition thing, it also is a really unattractive user experience, and it creates a lot of friction for the user wanting to work with that company. Or even, earlier this year, I had forgotten why I hadn't changed credit cards in 20 plus years, because it's an absolute pain in the face. I had to fill out God knows how many forms, and I had to prove this and that and a bill, and it was ridiculous, an absolute utter joke. And I tried it 3 different times, and I gave up each time because I just ran out of steam, but eventually I got it completed. But horrific. So it's very expensive for companies. It's really time consuming for the individuals. So that's one example. But that's not the only one. So another massive cost area that companies, and it's a self-inflicted wound, which is entity resolution. I can't count how many times, and this was when I was in the AI space and we were doing kind of entity resolution was the kind of one of these algorithms you do to identify these two people are the same. But like we create these problems for ourselves by having multiple disconnected processes where people are sharing information, and even within the same organization, they can have many, in fact, the big organizations have many, many different silos, and then they spend millions and millions on doing entity resolution. And this is a self-inflicted wound. If you think about the self-sovereign identity model where the wallet is the integration point, if the wallet has proof of all these identities in there and they're provable and verifiable, I have resolved myself. The entity resolution happens at the wallet, and that person is the best person positioned to resolve who they are. So I think we get rid of millions and millions of cost around entity resolution is another example. And then related to that is the other area is all about this identity integration piece. If I'm a big company, I have many different ID&V services I have to integrate with to verify different forms of identity, be it whether I'm Europe, in North America, whatever. And these are all completely separate integrations. If you think about, again, the wallet becomes the integration. The proof exchange is effectively the API. And what that allows you to do is essentially decouple yourself from the ID&V process and actually have verifiable credentials as basically the proof of identity. So the cost savings are, the risk, obviously it kind of goes without saying, you're avoiding collecting unnecessary data. That helps you things like for GDPR compliance and just general, HIPAA and various other types of regulations. You're minimizing the type of PII that you have to store, because with verifiable credentials, I use the example of your credit card. When you go to a website, you don't have to have them hold your credit card detail. You can basically verify it on demand when you want to buy something. The reason you don't do that sometimes is because it can be time consuming. Whereas if it's super, super simple for you to just verify a fact about yourself, then the relying party doesn't have to hold it. So they don't have to store as much data, which minimizes risk of data theft, identity fraud, and also the other big thing is complex consent flows. Today's world, where you basically the person isn't the orchestrator of the data exchange, and it's happening between two companies on the backside, then you have to start collecting consent. Then you have to start tracking consent. And then what happens if I revoke consent? The data's lost, it's gone. So then you have to start calling up telephone numbers and requesting your it's a complete palaver. So that's another example of some of the risk and then associated costs that you get rid of if you go with an SSI model.
And it's interesting when you're talking about one thing that we've looked at a lot, the workforce example in your own personal situation, Marie, of moving jobs from IBM to Accenture at the start of this year. One thing that we speak about a lot internally at Doc is that in many cases when you're going through that interview process, you're giving information all the time at that point, and that goes into kind of one silo. And then when you actually, let's say you get the job and then you're actually kind of onboarding to the company, like you say, there's potentially a different team, but you're giving them all the exact same information again.
Yeah.
Why during that interview process, when they're capturing data from you, if you held that as some kind of credential, that you could then pass that information to a different team within the same large entity, and that can be used to help your onboarding flow and make that much more efficient.
Yeah, and it's actually so you kind of hit the nail. I know you were going to ask a question later on about Total Enterprise Reinvention, but you sort of hit the nail on the head there. So I just want to quickly touch on a point. So some years ago, I did a really interesting research project in this space around decentralized data exchange with a large automotive client, and what we actually recognized, to your point, was that using credentials to actually navigate and execute and optimize workflow and processes was absolutely massively, hugely untapped potential, instead of having these things managed in these centralized systems. That in fact, if you think about it, when I start the process of applying for a job, I've sent an application credential in, so I've got a record, I've got something, I know the status of it. As something changes, they can reissue or they can revoke and reissue. So at all time, I know where I am. The transparency is there. And then if I need to update it or I change my address, they're not keeping all these copies of the data there. So it really becomes, and then at the end of the process, when I'm actually been extended a job, that credential now gets either updated or so now this credential is actually my work credential, my access. You don't need a separate process to go in and actually then start creating IDs and access controls, and which is another interesting challenge we've explored with clients, where because the ID&V is completely disconnected from access management. What happens is that the line of business goes through this process. They store a bucket load of data in a database, and then when they're finished, they either ready to onboard the customer or to hire the employee, they throw something over to the CIO's office. And then they're dealing with this whole mess of stuff that they have to now start giving access. And then there's complaints about how long it takes and the delays. Whereas it shouldn't be something, it should be integrated into the flow. And that, I think, is a completely untapped opportunity for maximizing and realizing real value around self-sovereign identity outside of the pure data.
Yeah, very much so. And I know that we've touched on it there. And I don't know if there's another, I mean, we've talked there about the kind of new value propositions that the SSI and Decentralized Identity provides. Are there others that you would highlight, Marie, that you'd want to expand on?
Yeah, so I think, as I indicated a few minutes ago, there's many different use cases. I would argue every single touch point between organizations and between organizations and individuals has the potential to be improved and, made more streamlined through things like verifiable credentials or tokenization of data. But what we're looking at as a starting point is those which are the easiest ones to get started. They're somewhat constrained so that you can actually get started. The worker is a perfect example. The other one I think that's a really good example is the whole trusted organizations, kind of the supply chain side of things. How do I onboard organizations? Because that is a massive cost to companies, and it's also a massive risk. If you think about it, is this supplier, especially if it's a regulated industry where a supplier has to have a certain certification or a certain, an ESG level or whatever the thing might be, how do you verify that they do, and how do you keep it up to date? So if something changes, how do you ensure? So I think we see also the whole area of onboarding of organizations, managing organization records, for the whole things like the supply chain is a really untapped opportunity. And we're already starting to see a lot of interest from clients in trying to figure out how can we make this more streamlined. So it's not just about onboarding them, but keeping their data up to date and ensuring that they're always valid, be it their bank accounts details, be it their certifications, or that they've got no strikes against them, whatever the checks you might have for your particular business process.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, and I'm trying to resist getting into the whole topic of trust registries because I think that kind of plays into this, but I'll not go down that rabbit hole just now. What it seems like, kind of stepping back a little bit, Marie, what it may seem like to the mass market for people that maybe haven't been in and around the decentralized technology so much is that we seem to have had this kind of bipolar situation of either we have no privacy at all and tons of information sharing. So social networks, social media, things of that nature, where we're sharing everything and we know that we're being preyed upon by large companies to basically sell advertising or selling us effectively to advertisers. And then we're trying to marry that up to this newish movement. I would say it's been around for a while, but maybe just starting to get a little bit more market traction now with regards to us being concerned about privacy. It's becoming a little bit more mainstream, that notion. How do we balance these two things together of data privacy for the individual and also the ability to share information that makes our lives potentially a lot more convenient?
Yeah, I mean that's kind of a hard question because obviously, so privacy is in the eye of the beholder. If you talk to some people in some regions, they have a very different definition of what they think privacy is or what it means, and even if you look at demographics, age demographic, it means something different to everybody else. When I think about privacy, I to some extent I think about it less about privacy and more about things like security, things like ethics, which is that what we want to be able to ensure is that people are safe from bad actors. So that might mean identity theft. And this is all, again, it's related to privacy, but it's really more about how do I keep myself safe? How do I ensure that my data doesn't get stolen, my identity doesn't get stolen, money doesn't get stolen, I can't be fought. So there's a whole security aspect which is directly related to the amount of data that you exchange. So this concept of leaking data. And that's going to be increasingly an issue as we see the world going more. I'm part of the Accenture Metaverse Business Continuum Group, where we look at this new type of digital society, which is combining AR and VR and different types of experiences. And when we think about the world in that, and that relates a little bit to the IoT, we're going to be exchanging data at multiple different touch points as we move around our worlds. It might be when we get into our car using our smartphone or our smartwatch to get into our car. Our car will need to check that we're indeed the owner of the car, that we have a valid driving license to drive the car, and that we've got insurance coverage to drive the car, as an example. So we're going to be exchanging data with loads of devices, loads of doors entering buildings. If we don't do this right, our data is going to be leaking all over the shop, and we're going to be at risk. So there's that thing to consider. But at the same time, to the example of the car, just the convenience of not losing your car keys could be a very, very nice convenience, making sure that, for people, for insurance companies, and making sure that they know this person, only people that have insured that car are able to drive the car. So it does create these really, really nice user experiences. From my standpoint, the reason why I feel so passionately about a kind of an SSI model is because I would argue it is the only way to build a future digital society that isn't Orwellian in nature. It's the only way. We cannot continue going down this route of just data leaking everywhere. It just isn't sustainable. And not just because of, so obviously security, also there is the exploitation, the manipulation side of things as well. So I guess from my standpoint is what I really, really want to see happen with putting my AI hat on is I want to basically see individuals having greater autonomy and agency around the data that they're sharing. The other thing I think which is absolutely critical that most of the solutions I built over the past few years have focused on is transparency. The other upside of the person being involved in the data exchange is the transparency that enforces. Not just the transparency about what I know what I'm sharing to an individual, to an organization, and I know what I'm allowing them to do with it. But I would argue, and this is something which doesn't happen today, and to me this is probably the number one thing that needs to happen, and needs to be regulated, is complete transparency. And by that what I mean is, so if I'm sharing data with a third party, they need to let me know what data that they have about me. What I think is absolutely unsustainable and is horrific is for a company to know more about me than I know about myself. And that doesn't sit with me. So if, for example, a social media company happens to know that I'm somebody that can be easily manipulated and really believes X, Y, and Z, and they're using that data to push ads to me as an example or to do something else, I should know that they know that about me. Because, and I think there's a couple of benefits to that approach. One is, and there's this, that Supreme Court, there's a Supreme Court judge, about 100 years ago who was quoted as saying, sunlight is known to be the best disinfectant. And I would argue the same thing, is if I, as a company, have to share with an individual what I know about them, not necessarily how I generated it, if that's their proprietary algorithm, but what I know, it does a couple of things. It takes away the weaponization piece, because they can't weaponize it anymore. And also, it means that companies are going to be very careful about what insights they generate, because they are not going to want to have to say, okay, I just classified you as, as highly manipulatable. Because they have to tell somebody, and that's going to be an insult to the person. And so it all of a sudden makes companies thinking about, well, I only want to use properties, I only want to generate properties about an individual and use those properties if I'm not ashamed of them, because I may have to actually show them to the person. So it would completely change the power dynamics.
Yeah, it's very well put, and I think as well, it's I think we've all had those conversations where we'll chat to our partner or a family member or something like that, and then the next time we go to online, the thing that we're talking about starts to appear in our feeds or something like that, or in our search, and you kind of wonder where that comes from. I also kind of know that my wife used to use a Whoop strap, and it tells everything, like what's her heart rate through the day, like how well did she sleep and stuff. And I would say to her, like, are you comfortable with this company having all this information about you? And I think it's only now that people are starting to become concerned or thinking about, like, how well do you know this company? How well are they securing that data? So I think that's a factor as well. But as you say, reducing the weaponization of that data would be huge, and making those companies give a lot more transparency, like you said, would be massive.
Yeah.
We've spoken a lot about different use cases. We talked about a little bit about workforce, talked about healthcare as well. I think you also mentioned supply chain. So I think you mentioned that SSI is the future of the global data supply chain. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So when I talk about the supply chain as a use case, I'm talking about in kind of traditional supply chains, so kind of companies onboarding them. When I'm thinking about the SSI as a global data supply chain, in that context, really what I'm just thinking about is how data flows. So if we believe that our future is going to be digital, which I think we all recognize, is going to be, powered by AI, and it's going to be fueled by data. I think those are three facts that nobody's going to argue. So it means that data is going to basically be the fuel that's going to drive everything, and how data flows through our system and our economies is going to be critical. And that's kind of where I think of decentralization and the self-sovereign identity model as being the future. And I think you referenced, I wrote a blog post a while ago that equating self-sovereign identity is to data as streaming is to music, because I've been thinking about how to describe this when I have this conversation with clients and partners, and to me the streaming model is perfect. There's a perfect analogy on a couple of fronts. If we think about what happened with streaming, 10 odd years ago. So we used to always buy, if I wanted to listen to songs, to music, I would have to buy a CD. So I'd buy a CD with a stack of songs in it. So the same thing the way companies today buy data. They buy data about Marie, and it's basically a stack of data. And sometimes they buy it with my permission, so I'm onboarding, I have to prove my academic qualification. Accenture would go and they'd get my transcript, and that would prove, that. So companies buy a block of data the same way as I would have bought a CD. And then every time I wanted to listen to a song, I'd have to pull out the CD, I have to stick it in the CD player, and then I'd have to play that song. And if there's any new songs that she has to have, I'd have to buy another CD. And so that CD and that data becomes out of date relatively quickly. And then there's new versions of it updated with new technologies, and I'm going to have to buy another CD if I want it. So if we think about that analogous to the way SSI works, where instead of you buying this block of data, which you then have to stick in your CD cabinet or you stick in your MDM system, you have to manage it and make sure it doesn't get stolen and all that sort of good stuff, and keep it updated. What you basically do is you have streaming data. So you basically, if you need to know Marie, her past employment, she worked with IBM, you don't have to go to IBM and get this proof of employment letter or data piece and store it in a database. You just basically send a proof exchange to Marie's wallet to check with Marie, did you indeed work with IBM? And proof response will come back and say, yes, she did. So essentially it's like this streaming. Now the thing that's interesting about streaming, if we think about what streaming did, it obviously minimized the need to have CD cabinets to store your CDs, so your data storage reduced. But the other thing that it did significantly is it reduced fraud. Reduced, fraud in terms of music, piracy was reduced. And also it increased usage, which a lot of people were kind of influenced, but the amount of music now being consumed is significantly higher than was being consumed when we were going out stacks of CDs. So it increased the consumption of the music, and in a variety of different ways. So that's where I think the opportunities of self-sovereign identity, that it's going to reduce the need to store data, it's going to reduce fraud in terms of incorrect data being exchanged, and it's going to increase the type of use cases that you're going to be able to realize, because the individual will have data verified on demand and will be able to have these new seamless experiences. So that to me is what I think is really an exciting opportunity for us to realize moving forward, and kind of the reason why I use that supply chain analogy.
Excellent. Yeah, and I like the music analogy as well. I don't miss those shelves load of CDs. I think having Spotify or streaming services is much more convenient, isn't it? And you get it across all your devices. So definitely a step in the right direction there. We touched on this point a little bit earlier, Marina. I kind of know you referenced it early in the discussion. I was going to ask you, in what ways do you think decentralized identity will help business leaders realize a total enterprise reinvention strategy? Maybe you could tell us about that.
Yes, absolutely. So this to me is I think this is really an interesting way, and again, why I kind of think that this is just decentralized identity. But if you think about it today, so if we think about IAM, so identity often as it's delivered today, it's predominantly sold into the CIO's office, and it's a technical capability needed to control access. So that's what its purpose is. It's about access management. And it's part of the CIOs. It's a very kind of vertical capability needed that's technical and, not something anybody in the lines of business really cares about. They just expect you can get access to a system. If we start to now think about data and identity-related data in a completely different way. So let's use the worker example. So when I think about all the different types of information that I might need when I onboard a worker, proof of past employment, proof of right to work, proof of identity, proof of academic qualification, maybe proof of certification for certain jobs. So you've got all these different pieces of data that you now need to collect. That's separate from access to a system. You also, by the way, need to give them access to a system. I know, like when I joined Accenture, they have this really great portal for people looking for applying for a job in Accenture. So I also get an access token as well. So you get all these different pieces of data. The thing that's really attractive and nice about decentralized identity or this decentralized data exchange is what it allows you to do is it allows you, I would argue for the first time, to expand the value proposition of identity outside of the CIO's office and now into the line of business. So now what you start to do is, we start in the worker example, reimagine how I could change the hiring process. And the opportunities are endless. It's obviously, there's the immediate thing is how I can reduce the cost of onboarding, so verifying all this data. But also just let's go a step further and just imagine that when I publish positions in my company, I publish them as verifiable credentials because they're provable an Accenture position. It can have the location, it can have the skills, it can have provably this is exactly what I'm looking to hire for. And then I, as an individual looking for jobs, if I have all my data, I can interact with that verifiable credential. So you could even argue, and this is where AI comes in, you could even argue, you could imagine, services evolving that allows you to be the dating agency between people and jobs, that allow you to do analysis between the credentials that I have in my wallet, which could be multiple for every course I took, every job I got, every project I worked on. And this becomes my history of all the work I've done. And then you can start actually mapping it to these types of opportunities that are out there in the marketplace. So it starts to completely reimagine how you do things like hiring. It also looks at things like companies are looking to be skills-based organizations. How do I understand the skills people have? Some of the skills they might get through doing courses inside the workplace, but very often it might be courses they did outside. And even if we think about courses or jobs that they've done inside work, if I think about when I work on a number of customer projects, a lot of that's confidential. I can't basically tell everybody I'm working with company X on Y. But there's no reason you couldn't have a verifiable credential that obfuscated, that didn't include that level of information, but proved that I've worked on an MDM project for a Fortune 500 company in this geo and I did X. So I then start to build up a portfolio of the projects I've worked in. Now that isn't just valuable for getting a new job, it's valuable inside the company. If I look at Accenture, how do you optimize a workforce? How do I identify the right people to work on the right projects? If every individual had a catalogue of their experience, of their capabilities that spanned everything from the jobs they've done to what they've learned, now you can use AI to really, really maximize and match the right people to the right jobs. So it could completely change how you do resource management within companies. And this is just some simple examples of what you could, and actually the thing that's funny, we could do this today. This isn't even difficult to do. This is like, we're inside Accenture. We're actually now starting to roll out verifiable credentials to all of our employees, starting to look at what are all the types of credentials that will be really valuable for employees to basically have in their wallet. So this isn't difficult, but then it allows you to totally reimagine how you manage your workforce. That's just one example, and there's dozens of examples that I could quote. This is just one. So I think one thing I would say, just one quick thing, the critical thing I find in this space is what people need to do is they need to flip the switch in their head. They need to stop thinking about data as this centralized MDM managed thing, and they need to start thinking differently about what data is and what it means to interact with business processes. If they flip the switch in their head, they'll see dozens and dozens and dozens of these opportunities bubble up within companies, opportunities just waiting to be solved.
You're obviously encapsulating IBM's old strapline, think different there with that statement. And there's a couple of interesting things that you said, but I think sometimes it's not the technical aspects that are lacking, like they're there, like you said, like the AI is sufficiently evolved, the verifiable technology and SSI is sufficiently involved, and sometimes it's people think those are the things that are holding us back, but it's actually then realigning business processes and operations, particularly inside large companies sometimes, to maximize the opportunities that exist with those technologies. So sometimes it's the the processes that can drag things a little bit slower. The other thing as well, I mean, I spent a brief part of my early career with IBM, and I remember how good at that time, I imagine it still is, but how good the in-house training was. And like you say, not being able to take some of the stuff that you'd learned there, whether it's with clients or actually on some kind of more formal training course, and actually take that learning and present it to someone in such a way where they know for sure it happened, and the credential or the training was actually conducted by IBM at that time, because it's a cryptographically signed thing. Like that not existing is definitely not great for the individual, but also probably not great for the company as well, because I'm sure the rates of people getting educated would increase significantly. I think there's studies to show this, if that individual can then take those learnings and demonstrate it to others. So I think there's a few really interesting things.
And to that point, I mean, like the on-the-job training as well. Like, so even outside of formal training, even like so credentializing the work you're doing. I just think this, if data is the fuel that drives an economy, we should be collecting more data, not less data. Data isn't the enemy. I would argue, as an employee, I want as much data as I can bring with me that's going to basically help me prove my value. And also then, maybe, as AI comes into the mix, help me get more interesting jobs and things like that. So I think it's credentializing more than even the formal training, just credentializing in general experiences that I have. Because right now what I have to do is I basically write things down, or I track things, or I might ask for recommendations on LinkedIn just so I have a history, because you forget all the cool stuff you do. So it would be really nice to have that credentialized so that you just have it, and over time that becomes, your resume isn't a resume. Your resume is effectively a database of experiences that you can bring to bear when you're looking for new jobs.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I think grasp the concept. I wonder, it's interesting, and you talked about Accenture. Are you using AI then to match, if you have experiences and some of your colleagues have experience within a specific sector use case, or is the intention that when you have a new client come on stream and they're looking for consultancy within a certain area, that they can pattern match effectively with the team members at Accenture that have that expertise, and they can say, look, almost suggest candidates that they should be working on this specific client project?
So right now what I would say is, so we're still in the early stages of, the key thing right now that I'm focused on is the credentialing piece, because the argument I always have is, AI, garbage in, garbage out. AI without good data is garbage. So right now what I'm focused on is, how can we allow individuals to hold the data that's going to be valuable to them. Now, in terms of how Accenture, allows individuals to share that data for opportunities, is kind of a completely separate conversation that would happen. So I don't want to kind of put something like that on Accenture at this point. But what I would say is, we are recognizing that Accenture, like any company, we need to allow our employees to hold their data. So they want to know proof of employment, because they might need that if they're going to rent an apartment or something like that. They might want to hold their certifications in their wallet. They might want to be able to hold, So right now we're focused on what are the data that individuals, employees would actually really benefit from holding and having it credentialized. But that's just the beginning, because nobody gets up in the morning and says, I'd love to have a wallet with loads of really cool data in it. What they want is, they want the wallet with the loads of cool data because it gives them some value. It gives them a discount. It gives them, a fast track going through the airport. It gets them fast track when they're looking for a job. It gets them to find a really, really cool project in Accenture, as an example. So what we have to subsequently do is, we have to then look and say, okay, now that individuals have access to this really great data, what could you do with the data? And again, the self-sovereign identity approach is, it's not just what you as big company can do with it, but what do your employees want you to do with it? Because again, what the joys of giving people their data is, you're giving them agency. And that with it becomes, it's both scary and it's powerful, because as they say, if you love somebody, let them free. If they love you back, they'll come back to you. If they don't, they never loved you in the first place. So you have to, in a way, trust your employees that you're giving them data, which they might go off and they might use to get another job, or they might use to find really cool projects within your own company. So I think this is a really interesting conversation that we're having. We don't have all the answers yet, but I think we want to first of all make sure that we can get data credentialized, and then we have to figure out then what would the value be for both the company and the individuals to be able to use that data for new use cases.
Okay, and Marie, what are you seeing as some of the, I mean, we're definitely starting to see, I think, and it's great to hear about Accenture as well, starting to issue credentials to your team, because what the industry has lacked to this point, the industry being the SSI industry, is large real world use cases, lots of big pilots and exciting stuff. But I think that what we've lacked and that we're starting to see now are kind of large production level projects. But what are you seeing as the challenges that are being faced by organizations working within the kind of decentralized identity SSI space? We've touched on things in the past about kind of business models being tricky. But what are some of the challenges that you're seeing companies starting to use all this different types of technology?
So let me just quickly say, the reason I joined Accenture, so obviously I've been 20 odd years at IBM. They were a great company. I loved working with them. I don't have a bad thing to say about the company. It was a great experience. But having spent like the last, say, 6-7 years kind of in this SSI space and doing a lot of the understand the technology, I believe we've gotten to the stage where we need to now take the next step, which is, okay, it may not be perfect, not everything is implemented, some of the standards are still kind of evolving, but we have more than enough to get started and to start to deliver real value. So if I think about where we are today, I would say there's been a lot of focus on the issuing side of things. How do we issue credentials? But the demand side is actually where the real value is. So how do I consume credentials to deliver really these new, exciting, valuable user experiences to people and to companies? So this is kind of why I joined Accenture, because Accenture is a company that has deep roots in the business transformation side of things and reimagining the enterprise across many different clients across many geos. So that to me is kind of the big challenge that has sort of hasn't been tapped in. And it was also, as when I did the COVID pass stuff with IBM Digital Health Pass, that was the kind of key thing that kind of kept coming up again and again. Issuers would say, well, who are the verifiers? And verifiers say, well, who are the issuers? So really, we didn't have both sides of the equation. So what I think is really critical, and what I'm actively doing and we're doing in Accenture, is looking at the demand side. How can we identify those business problems that exist today that are uniquely and powerfully solved with an SSI model of data exchange? And what we're doing is really starting to build out the value plays there. Things like integrating with systems like Workday, for example, moving forward. Look, maybe Salesforce and ServiceNow. And so how can we start to allow credentials to be natively integrated into big enterprise systems, business processes? So if I think about the challenges today, it's the people point you mentioned earlier. People haven't really seen the potential. They haven't seen the business problem. So part of what we're doing is trying to educate people, helping them to understand the problems that they have that are uniquely solvable with SSI models. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is there is kind of an entrenched, like the old centralized model of data. A lot of people have built their careers on MDMs and data lakes, and they see it all about owning data and controlling data, and data's opaque. We're basically telling, you don't own the data anymore. Let the data subject have the data. Don't always be in control with everything. Let them have control. Don't be opaque. Be transparent. I mean, this is mind-blowingly weird for a lot of people. So that's kind of a bit of a challenge, getting people to flip the switch in their head. The other thing I would say is the economic models. And this is a problem that we're really focused on. We've been working with our partner ecosystem and something we call the value diamond, which is ensuring that all participants in the network, so both the issuers who maybe have the data and they want to be incentivized to release it to the people, the verifiers, the relying parties consuming the data, they're getting the value, you've got the data subject, and then you've got the technology provider. So how can we ensure everybody gets so the economics of it is still, and then the other piece as well, which relates to the economic model, is kind of things like the technical I think is less the issue, but there is some technical, but things like the legal aspects of it as well, the legal framework. So we do have some challenges that we absolutely have to work on, but we absolutely have enough in the can already, and we have enough problems that are uniquely solved with this that I think we're ready to go. And that's what we're focusing on right now, the demand side, getting these business use cases humming with verifiable credentials.
Yeah, really interesting. Marie, you've been a fantastic guest. We could keep going. I think, well, I could certainly keep going for quite a while yet, but I think for the sakes of certainly your schedule and how long the episode would be, let's leave it there. But the insights today have been fascinating. I think your long experience working in different technological areas and then working with lots of different companies has given you kind of a range of experience that not many people have. So really appreciate you coming on and giving us those insights.
Thank you very much. It was lovely being here. Thanks, guys.